Here we're going to discuss attitudes and behavior. So, attitudes are quickly defined as evaluations of ideas, events, objects, or people. And so when we think about attitudes, it's the feelings we have towards things. And they're usually positive or negative, and often uncertain. And so we might feel very positively about Starbucks, or particularly negatively about Starbucks. Or we might not have a strong opinion either way. Political candidates or political policy decisions, this uncertainty often comes into play. And so defining and measuring attitudes and discovering people's attitudinal feelings is important to both marketing research, strategic communication campaigns, as well as political communication campaigns. And so we can think of attitudes as a relatively enduring predisposition. And so it's not that attitudes can't change, but that it's very difficult to change them. And so they're a hypothetical construct. We can't see them. They're not tangible. We don't actually know where they lie or how they come about quite often. Right? They cannot be directly observed. But since they influence purchasing behavior, opinions, and choices we make, we're very interested in discovering more about them. And so we can do this by both qualitative and quantitative methods. In these cases, we're going to be talking about it in terms of survey research, but certainly interviews and focus groups can be used to assess attitudes. Okay, what's the connection between attitudes and behaviors? Attitudes influence people's behavior. But they're also influenced by people's behavior. And so our own behavior, the choices we make or the actions we take, influence our attitudes every bit as much as the attitudes we have influence our future behavior. And so one of the things at work here is commitment and consistency. And as humans, we want to appear consistent with what we've done. We want to have a coherent whole that we present to the world. And so if we've taken a certain behavior, we've made certain choices, generally speaking, our attitudes will reflect the choices we've made. And that's part of being consistent. And then one of the ways that marketing works is once you find and identify those values or attitudes people have, you can ask them to take actions to remain consistent with the commitments they've already said they have. Are you committed to environmental justice? Yes. Will you sign this petition to stop fracking in California? Oh, shoot. Now I guess I have to because I want to appear consistent with my statement of my attitude. Right? And so attitudes are structured by three components. First one is affect, and that's our emotional reaction to an attitude object. And so if the attitude object is, say, a snake, I really don't like snakes. I feel fear and anxiety around a snake. And so that's my emotional reaction. That is different than my behavioral reaction, what I might do when I'm exposed to a snake. And so I might not like them. I might be a little anxious, but I might be able to sit calmly on a couch with a snake in the room. Or I might run screaming from the room. Right? But that's my behavior, and it's related to, but not necessarily directly demonstrative of, my affect towards the attitude object. And then the third element is my cognition about snakes. And so what do I believe or know about an attitude object? And so I might know that the snake is safe, that is somebody's pet, and that might not impact my affect towards it. Right, and so in those cases, that's sort of a negative affect and how that might work out. In a positive affect, I really like dogs. My emotional reaction to a dog is one of intense joy and happiness. My behavior is one of absolute glee. I want to pet it. I want to hug it. I talk to it in baby voice. And then cognition, I believe dogs are good inherently and helpful and friendly and yay. Right, and so those line up to demonstrate or reflect a positive attitude. Now, of course, somebody who's had negative experiences with dogs might have a very different attitude towards dogs. And so another example of this, right? Cognitive. My supervisor gave a promotion to a coworker who deserved less than me. My supervisor is unfair. So that's cognition. It's based on evaluation of situation and knowledge. This happened, therefore this is my conclusion. right? My supervisor is unfair. This is what I believe because of this example, this instance. I dislike my supervisor. Now that's affective. It's based on feeling. You might dislike your supervisor and they might be completely fair. Or they might be completely unfair, but you might still, for whatever reason, like them a bit. Right? So affect is feeling. It's based on feeling. And then I'm looking for other work. I've complained to my supervisor and to anyone who would listen, right? And so that's behavioral. It's based on action. This is what you are doing, the action you are taking that also is being influenced by your affective feelings and your cognition, right? And so these three are all related even though they're distinct actions. So, right, there's components of an attitude: the cognitive, the opinion or belief segment of an attitude, my pay is low. Affective, emotional or feeling segment, I am angry over how low I am paid. And the behavioral component, I'm looking for another job that pays better. And so attitudes, to go back, can be implicit or explicit. And so an implicit attitude, something like this.
Hello, Ben. Can I explain any consumer behavior concepts?
Professor Siegfried, what are implicit attitudes?
Well, Ben, implicit attitudes are thought and feelings that occur outside a person's conscious awareness or control towards a product. For example, a subject might have a favorable attitude towards a celebrity, which positively influences their response to advertising utilizing the celebrity's voice. However, it works in reverse. If the subject was unable to identify the celebrity behind the voice.
Thanks, Professor, for explaining implicit attitudes.
So that exciting video was a way of illustrating that implicit attitudes are unconsciously formed. We don't necessarily see Jennifer Aniston advertising something and think, oh, I like Jennifer Aniston, therefore I'm going to like this water. We might see her and think, oh my god, I really like Jennifer Aniston. Like, I have a warm feeling towards her. She was Rachel on Friends, so on and so forth. She seems so nice. And therefore pay more attention to the ad or put more value on her opinion. But it isn't necessarily an explicit thing. Right? And those are even sometimes unknown to us. What our implicit attitudes are, we might not be aware of, and it might be hard for us, therefore, to express them. And for us conducting research on attitudes, it's important to keep that in mind, because we need to be aware of what that sometimes our respondents can't be explicit about what they're thinking or feeling because it's subconscious. And implicit attitudes can be favorable or unfavorable. And they're often influenced by experience. And so if you perhaps ate something in a restaurant that gave you food poisoning, you probably have a generally negative feeling either towards that restaurant or towards that food item, even if you might know that it's okay to eat it again, right? The taste might still be off. And so implicit attitudes can be something kind of akin to that, right? You had a bad experience with something, or even you saw a movie at a time you were really upset, and you're going to have like a hostile reaction to that movie or to the actors, perhaps, right? That sort of emotional attitude comes together in a weird way. The other type of attitudes are explicit attitudes, and here's another equally exciting video.
Hello, Ben. Can I explain any consumer behavior concepts?
Professor Siegfried, what are explicit attitudes?
Well, Ben, explicit attitudes are easy to report as people are consciously aware of them. For example, when evaluating a new car, we are asked questions such as, what do you think of a VW Golf? We might have either a positive or negative attitude towards the VW Golf.
Thanks, Professor, for explaining explicit attitudes.
Explicit attitudes, we're dealing with something consciously formed that we've perhaps done research on or had enough experience with that we know how or why we feel that way about it. If it's a person, we might have had a particularly negative or positive interaction with them that led us to form our belief. If it was a car, perhaps we conducted research in Consumer Reports or have always owned a Ford or a Honda and feel positively about them based on our experience, or negatively based on our experience. And so it's known. Our attitude about it is something that's known to us and most likely to others. So it's easy to self-report. If we ask somebody how they feel about it, they know right away and why they feel that way. And so explicit attitudes are also impacted by factors such as social desirability. And so oftentimes we state things that we believe or feel based on the desire to appear socially desirable, whether we know it's a good brand, or we might say that we love organic food because that seems like something we should like. We love to work out, or I would really like to run a marathon because that's something that's socially desirable. And so another way of thinking about this, or how attitudes influence behavior, is the hierarchy of effects model. And that contains three main categories: think, feel, and do. And so they can go in either direction. You can begin with the purchase of an item that you don't really have an opinion about, have a conviction about it, develop a preference for the item or brand, move into liking, which is stronger than preference, learn more about it, and then be very aware about it. It can work in reverse, right? You begin with awareness about the existence of a particular thing, knowledge, you begin to learn about it, you decide you like it, you develop a preference, you have a conviction, and then you eventually make the purchase. And so to go back with car buying, when I had to buy a four-wheel drive car a few years ago, I was living up in the mountains of New York, and it was quite snowy. Right, I was aware of the type of car I needed. I wanted something that would work well in the snow. I wanted something that would that had good gas mileage, and I needed all-wheel drive because it was very hilly and icy up there. Now, that led to knowledge because I began to research types of cars, pricing, longevity, how much repairs they needed, how easy was it to get the parts to repair them, and so on. I began to like a few brands. Then I developed a preference for particular makes and models over others, which led to a conviction eventually that I was really convinced that I was going to go with this one car. And eventually I bought the car. Right? Conversely, my sister bought an Audi from her mother-in-law. She never really thought about it. The car was for sale. She needed a car. It was easy. And then she began to really like the car. She developed a preference for Audis. She began to learn about the sort of car that it was and what made it special in its car class. And so she's got a lot of awareness, right? So she thinks about it. And so that example works in reverse as well. You also have the AIDA model: awareness, interest, desire, and action. And so these things move, right? We move from awareness, we want to develop interest, to desire, to action. And so advertising works this way, right? You want to make people have to know about your product before they can be interested in it. And then they have to desire it. They have to want it in their lives before they take action, which is purchasing or using your service or doing whatever. Okay, and so how do we weigh the importance of beliefs? Because they're not all-encompassing. And so not all beliefs are equally important to an individual. So some beliefs are stronger held. They're a closer part of our identity about who we think we are. And so it's important to think about how we might evaluate which beliefs are more malleable than others, right? To determine how much it matters in a decision one is making. I really like organic food, but if I can get limes for 50 cents cheaper each, maybe I'm easily swayed. How strong is that conviction? And so the components for weighing the importance of beliefs are knowledge, affect, and intentions, right? And so consistency comes into play here. Persuasion can be difficult because people are resistant to changing strongly held beliefs. But we don't always behave consistently with our attitudes. Some of those reasons we might be unable to do so. I love grass-fed beef, but I don't really have the income to make sure that that's all I eat exclusively, right? There's also competing demand for resources. I would love to send my child to a private school, but that money needs to go somewhere else right now. There's also social influence, also known as peer pressure. And then measurement problems. And so we might measure somebody who's having a particular attitude, but they might not have given us very reliable answers. They might not have known very much about a product, or they might not really be aware of how strongly held that belief is when it's put to the test or challenged in some way. And so those are things to think about with the consistency question regarding attitudes and beliefs. And so how do we measure attitudes, right? We've been talking about what they are, what types of form they take, how they influence behavior, but when it comes down to doing research, how do we measure them? And as you can see here, we've got scales. Ranking scales, rating scales, sorting scales, and choice scales. So what do they look like? A ranking scale looks like this. You rank things. Please rank the following customer service factors from most to least important to you when interacting with our agency. And so here people would have to choose one or the other as far as what's most important to them, right? You'd wind up, after you collect that from, 100 people, you'd be able to collate the answers and see overall what is the most important thing, followed by what is the most important second most important thing, and so on. And so that would give you a holistic idea about how important these items are to people's customer satisfaction. Right? Another type of rating scale, conversation rating scale. So, you go all the way from I'm so happy, I could listen to you all day, to I'd rather put a drill through my brain. So that brings us to sorting scales. And this is a sort of scale, it's not done very often because it's very a little bit more complex, but you're asking people to sort concepts from favorable to least favorable, right? And so you take different ideas or things and you put them in order. And so again, similar to a ranking scale, you see how people move around with the ideas and what sort of order they want to put them in. Choice scale, right? So which brand do you choose when it comes to answering these questions, right? So which brand is most likely to reduce static cling? Which brand softens clothes? Which leaves clothes with a clean scent? And so on. A Likert scale is the one we're perhaps most familiar with. It's a 5 to 7 point scale that allows individuals to express how much they agree or disagree with a particular statement. And so it looks like that. Wikipedia has a user-friendly interface. Agree. Wikipedia is usually my first resource for research. Strongly agree. Then you disagree. Then you strongly agree. And then you're neutral. Right? And so something to think about when we construct our choice scales are the response categories. One is that you provide verbal category definitions. You don't just want to list 1 to 5. We don't know what 1 to 5 is. Right? Is 5 positive or negative? Right? Scales should generally have at least 4 categories, but more generally 5 to 9 is ideal. So the more response categories you have, you can get more distinction among respondents, but too many categories might be confusing. What is the difference between, on a scale of 1 to 15, what is the difference between a 12 and 13? And how are people, is that consistent among all respondents? That level, that mutation between 12 and 13? Or do some people find 13 to be way better than 12? Is that some sort of jumping point? And so you want to keep it to 5 to 9 and have them verbally, agree strongly, agree very strongly, and so on. You want to be balanced. You want an equal number of positive and negative choices. That's going to keep people from being neutral. And that might be beneficial depending on your question. Now, if it's a question about knowledge or about something that somebody could be truly unaware of or not have thought about in the world, you might want to have an unbalanced one where you'd have an odd number so that there could be a center point. And a forced answer is do not know, right? So you don't have an opportunity of saying that you do not know about the topic or subject or don't have an opinion on it. Those are called forced answers. Non-forced answers, therefore, include a do not know or not applicable or so on. Okay, now we get into semantic differential categories. Semantics are a way of saying words. So these are bipolar rating items. They're easy to read and quick to answer, which is why they're often used. And they assume 3 attitudinal dimensions that underlie how we evaluate things in our social environment. One is that we evaluate things, another is the power and potency of words, and the third is activity. All items on a semantic differential should relate to these dimensions. That is to say, the words you choose should relate to an action, should relate to a level of power, or a type of evaluation. So, clean or dirty, bright or dark, low quality or high quality, conservative or innovative, inconvenient or convenient. So on this semantic differential scale, you would describe either Kmart, Walmart, or Target as belonging more or less to these adjectives, which are opposite, right? And so some of them relate their evaluation, right? Is Target clean or dirty? Are they convenient or inconvenient? Conservative or innovative, right? And that's not particularly demonstrable, right? It's, just an attitude you'd have towards them. Another one here, for each pair of adjectives, place a cross at the point between them, which reflects the extent to which you believe the adjectives describe policemen. Clean, dirty, honest, dishonest, kind, cruel, helpful, unhelpful, fair, biased, strong, weak, foolish, wise, energetic, or lazy, unreliable, or reliable. And here we can see this was taken from a previous study, Robson, 1993. And so this is an example here I wanted to point out of using secondary research to lead to a scale. So you don't have to necessarily always create your own scale, but you could build on a scale created by somebody else and perhaps use their results to buoy or compare and contrast your own. Okay, so now that we've talked about scales and types of measurements and surveys, let's talk about writing good survey questions. So the first question is, do you want to write an open-ended question or not? An open-ended question allows respondents to answer in their own words. A closed-ended question, as you might imagine, makes you choose from a fixed set of answers. And now there's different reasons why you would choose these. One of the benefits of open-ended is that you do get probably a more genuine response to how the respondent feels. And people might surprise you with their creativity. You might get some ideas or insights you hadn't yet thought of. But they can be very hard to code and to segment and to collate into data because you're dealing with words that won't necessarily be very easily comparable from one answer to the next. Closed-ended questions are easily collated into data and tabulated into numerical form, but you have limited the number of options a respondent can have, and so therefore the creativity or sort of veracity of the response might differ. And so something to think about, another thing to think about the chapter brings up is writing good questions. And so I want to think about what is wrong with this question. The government should force you to pay higher taxes, and then you're provided with a Likert scale. So you probably have noticed that the question itself is very leading, right? It's using force and pay higher taxes, which generally speaking, nobody wants to do. And force sounds very negative. They also don't give you a context for it. Why would we be paying higher taxes? The government should ask you to pay higher taxes to pay for highway improvement or for schools, or citizens should pay taxes to support public school systems. That question is worded very differently. It has a very different feeling. And so a slightly better answer is the government needs to raise taxes. Agree, strongly disagree. An even better one would add why they might want to raise taxes if you were looking to get a true sentiment about how people feel about a particular policy proposal. And again here, how would you rate the legendary career of Joe DiMaggio? Amazing or terrible? Well, you've already led with legendary career, and the two polars leave a lot of room between them. They're not very good measurement scales. And we don't know what lies between. If I answered, third from the left, what does that even mean about how I feel about Joe DiMaggio's career? Okay, so what's wrong with this question? What is your age? You might have noticed that there's overlap, right? So if I'm 10, do I answer 0 to 10 or 10 to 20? If I'm 20, am I 20 to 30? And so on. Another thing is that these are some pretty big leaps, depending on what you are measuring. So huge difference between a 10-year-old and an 18-year-old. Less difference between a 40-year-old and a 50-year-old, perhaps. I mean, maturity-wise, lifestyle-wise, and so on. And so you want to think about what brackets of demography are going to be useful for you. And so if you're looking to assess, if you're primarily interested in preteens and their attitudes about television, right, you might want to add more categories among younger ages so that you can get better data around that. Another thing to note is that 40 plus is a huge gap, huge differences between a 44-year-old and a 70-year-old. Another one, what type of vehicle do you own? Right? There's many more choices aside from van, SUV, and sedan. And so respondents looking to answer this question might just give up on your survey because they don't have any of these things. Right? And so you're failing to give mutually exclusive choices, and you're failing to give all options. Another problem is not asking direct questions. So, what do you like to do for fun? In what context? When? How much money do I have? What time of the day is it? How do you feel about crushed white strips? That's very broad. How do I feel? I mean, I don't really feel particularly strongly about them anyway. But if you were to ask, what suggestions do you have for improving crushed white strips? Now we've got something. Right? Now I'm thinking about, they taste kind of nasty, and I don't like having to leave them in for 30 minutes. That seems like a lot. I'm always worried about swallowing the stuff. And, I begin to kind of have some better ideas rather than my, oh, shoot, I do own those and I should be putting them on my teeth more often response. Another error is forgetting to put a prefer not to answer, particularly important with terms of demographics, such as income, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and so on. Right? So here, you're forcing people to answer, and they might actually prefer not to. And so in a lot of places, often, people will stop answering your survey if they don't want to answer these questions. And so often in the U.S., U.S. Americans skip the questions they don't want to answer and continue to finish the survey, but others will completely stop the survey completely. And so either way, you don't want skipped questions and you don't want half filled out surveys. And so you want to keep that from happening by adding a prefer not to answer and giving